Take this money and get lost, you delusional fool.
$8,000 scattered across the lawn, bills catching in rose bushes, drifting into champagne glasses.
Sir, I have my dignity. I can't...
Sterling Whitmore laughed, and one by one the guests laughed with him.
Dignity? Consider it charity, boy, because you're fired!
Sir, I haven't done anything wrong.
Sterling stepped closer, his shadow falling over Andrew's face.
Your presence here is already a stain, boy. Someone like you was never meant to stand on my grass.
Andrew's fists clenched. He knelt, picked up every bill one by one, and walked out. Nobody at that party knew 1 year later those $8,000 would change everything. And Sterling Whitmore, the billionaire who threw them as a joke, what he saw would drop his jaw to the floor. Have you ever felt that pure satisfaction of watching someone thrown in the dirt rise so high that the man who humiliated them had to come knocking because you are about to sow, hit, like? Drop a comment and let me take you back to where it all began, 6 hours earlier. The sky was still gray when Andrew Jacobs pushed open the iron gate of Whitmore Estate. 5 in the morning. The grass was cold and wet beneath his boots, and a thin layer of dew covered every leaf, every petal, every blade. He knew this garden the way a painter knows a canvas. Every rose bush, every stone path, every bed of lavender that lined the eastern wall. He had planted them all 3 years ago, when this 5-acre stretch was nothing but patchy grass and overgrown hedges. Now, it was something else entirely. The first light of dawn broke through the old oak canopy and spilled across the walkway in gold ribbons. Dewdrops on the David Austin roses caught the light and turned into tiny diamonds. The air smelled like wet soil and lavender and freshly cut grass. The kind of smell that hits you before your eyes are fully open. Andrew walked barefoot across the lawn. He always did. He liked the way cold grass pressed between his toes. It told him things, how moist the soil was, whether the roots were drinking, whether the ground needed rest. He stopped at the eastern border. The boxwood hedge stood in a perfect line, each branch trimmed at exactly the same angle. He had done that yesterday. Took him 4 hours. Nobody would notice. Nobody ever did. He pulled a worn notebook from his back pocket. The cover was falling apart, held together by a rubber band. Inside, every page was filled. Sketches, layouts, color palettes organized by season, drainage maps, sun exposure charts drawn from months of observation. This was Andrew's real work. Not the digging, not the weeding, the designing. Every curve in the walkway, every cluster of flowers, every line of sight from the terrace to the fountain. He had planned it all in this notebook. Then built it with his own hands. But nobody knew that. To Sterling Whitmore, Andrew was the man who mowed the lawn, nothing more. By 7, the sun climbed higher and the garden transformed. Golden light flooded every corner. The roses opened wider. Bees hummed around the purple salvia beds. The stone path glowed warm underfoot. This was the garden's best hour, the hour Andrew loved most, when everything he'd built came alive. He stood still for a moment and looked across the 5 acres. 3 years of his life, every single inch of it, his. Then the catering trucks arrived, white tablecloths, crystal glasses, silver trays of fruit and pastries. Servers in pressed shirts began setting up brunch stations between the rose beds. Sterling Whitmore's annual garden party, the event of the season. The head butler found Andrew near the greenhouse. "Finish before 9, then disappear. Mr. Whitmore doesn't want guests seeing you." Andrew nodded. He always nodded. By 8:45 he was still adjusting the last flower bed near the south entrance. The hydrangeas had tilted overnight. He couldn't leave them like that. That's when the first cars rolled through the gate. Black sedans, white SUVs, women in linen dresses, men in pastel blazers, stepping onto the lawn with champagne already in hand. Andrew moved toward the back hedge. If he could just slip through the service gate— "Andrew!" Sterling Whitmore's voice, calling his name across the garden. In front of everyone. Andrew stopped, turned around. The morning sun was behind Sterling, and all Andrew could see was a silhouette, a big man in a white blazer waving him over. He had no idea that the next 2 hours would end his life at Whitmore Estate forever, and begin everything else. The morning sun hung high and sharp over Whitmore Estate by 10 o'clock. Not a single cloud, the kind of light that makes everything beautiful and leaves nothing hidden. 50 guests spread across the lawn in linen and silk. Mimosas clinked. Laughter floated through the rose beds. A jazz quartet played softly near the fountain. The garden looked like a painting, colors so vivid they almost hurt. And every single one of those colors had been planted by Andrew Jacobs. He stood behind the boxwood hedge near the east side, half hidden, trimming branches he'd already trimmed. The butler had told him to disappear, but Sterling had called him over 20 minutes ago, then forgotten about him. So Andrew stayed in the margins, waiting for a chance to slip away. He didn't get one. Eleanor Caldwell found Sterling near the pergola. She was the editor-in-chief of Landscape Architecture Monthly, the kind of woman whose opinion could make or break a career. She held her mimosa up and turned in a slow circle. "Sterling, this is extraordinary. The layering, the color gradients, the way the stone path curves, it pulls you through the garden like a story." She lowered her glass. "Who designed this?" Sterling smiled, the wide smile, the one that never reached his eyes. "I brought in a top firm from the city. Cost me a fortune, but you can see the result. It's masterful, truly. The eastern section alone, the way the light hits those rose beds at this hour, that's not accidental. Someone understood this land. Well, you know me." Sterling raised his glass. "I have an eye for these things." From behind the hedge, Andrew heard every word. His hand tightened around the shears. 3 years. Every curve, every stone, every calculation of light and shadow. And Sterling had just erased him, with a smile and a lie. Then Eleanor noticed him. "Who's that?" Sterling glanced over. His smile didn't waver. "Oh, that's just the yard boy. Pulls weeds, trims the hedges. You know the basics." Eleanor tilted her head. "He seems to know his way around the beds quite well." "Sure, the way a janitor knows his way around a mop." Sterling took a long sip of his mimosa. "Between us, Eleanor, I keep him around because the agency I used to hire is 3 times the cost. He's cheap labor, that's all." A man in a linen shirt nearby chuckled. "Every estate needs one Sterling." "Exactly," Sterling winked. "Every estate needs someone to do the dirty work. And some people, well, that's all they were born to do." Yard boy, cheap labor, born to do the dirty work. Andrew felt each word land like a separate blow. He was 32 years old. He had been growing this garden since before Sterling even knew what a David Austin rose looked like. He had read more books on landscape architecture than anyone at that party had read in their entire lives. And he was the yard boy. His hand was shaking around the shears. He should have left right then, should have walked straight through the service gate and never looked back. Instead, he did something else. Andrew stepped out from behind the hedge and walked across the sunlit lawn. 50 guests turned. A black man, in worn boots and a faded flannel, walking straight toward the billionaire's circle. He reached Sterling and Eleanor. His voice was calm. "Excuse me, Mr. Whitmore. I don't mean to interrupt." He pulled the notebook from his back pocket and opened it to a page he'd worked on for months. "I've been developing a redesign for the Eastern Garden. I thought you might want to see it." The page was beautiful, hand-drawn, detailed. A complete landscape plan, elevations, plant, species, drainage, a seasonal bloom calendar. The kind of work that takes formal training to even read, let alone create. Eleanor leaned in. Her eyes widened. May I? But Sterling was faster. He snatched the notebook from Andrew's hands. He looked at the drawing for 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then his jaw tightened, and something shifted behind his eyes. The kind of look a man gets when someone beneath him dares to stand at his level. What is this? A redesign, sir, for the Eastern. I know what it is, Sterling's voice went low. What I'm asking is what made you think you had the right? He ripped the page out, held it up in the morning light for everyone to see, then tore it in half. The sound cut through the jazz, through the laughter, through the clinking glasses, 2 halves of a man's work drifting apart in the morning air. A woman near the fountain gasped quietly into her hand. Her husband put his arm around her and steered her toward the drink table. A server, carrying a tray of mimosas, stopped mid-step, stared at the torn paper on the grass, and then looked away as if he'd seen nothing. You're a gardener, boy. Sterling let the 2 halves float to the grass. You dig holes. You pull weeds. You do what I tell you. That's it. He threw the notebook onto the ground. Don't you ever come to me with this again. You're not a designer. You're not an architect. You're the help. Know your place. He turned to his guests with a shrug and an easy grin, like he'd just swatted a fly. Can you believe that the yard boy brought me a blueprint? He shook his head. What's next? The pool cleaner's going to pitch me a resort. A few guests laughed, short, uncomfortable laughs. The kind people make when they know something is wrong, but don't want to be the one who says it. A man in a blue blazer raised his glass. You're too patient with them, Sterling. I know, Sterling sighed theatrically. That's always been my problem. Andrew stood perfectly still through all of it. The morning sun was directly above. No shadows, no shade. Just bright, honest light on a man being torn apart in front of 50 people who sipped their mimosas and said nothing. Eleanor Caldwell looked away. She set her glass down and didn't pick it up again. She was the only one. Andrew bent down, picked up the 2 halves of his drawing, folded them carefully, put them in his pocket, then picked up his notebook from the grass. Yes, sir, he said, and turned to leave. He made it 7 steps. Wait! Sterling's voice, louder now, performative. He wanted an audience, and he had one. Come back here. Andrew stopped. His fists were at his sides, tendons in his forearms standing out like ropes. He turned, slowly. Sterling reached into the inside pocket of his white blazer. He pulled out a thick fold of bills, $8,000. He fanned them in the air like a deck of cards. You know what, Andrew? I've been too generous with you. 3 years I let you walk around here pretending you belonged. He looked at his guests, making sure they were watching. They were. 3 years I watched you shuffle around my property like you owned the place, touching my flowers, walking on my paths, sitting under my trees during your little breaks like this was your home. He stepped closer. His voice got louder. He wanted everyone to hear this part. Let me tell you something about people like you, Andrew. You don't build things. You don't create things. You don't design things. That's not in your DNA. You're the help. You've always been the help. Your father was the help, and his father before him. That's what your kind does. You serve. And when you forget that, when you come to a man like me with a piece of paper and try to pretend you're something you're not, this is what happens. He held up the money, fanned it slow. So let me give you a proper goodbye. He threw the money, not handed, threw. The bills exploded from his hand and scattered across the lawn, catching in rose bushes, drifting into champagne glasses, landing in the grass at Andrew's feet. Take this money and get lost, you delusional fool. 50 guests held their breath. Andrew looked at the bills on the grass, then at Sterling. Sir, I have my dignity. I can't. Dignity! Sterling barked a laugh, and one by one the guests laughed with him. Some nervous, some not. Consider it charity, boy, because you're fired. Andrew's voice barely held. Sir, I haven't done anything wrong. The laughter stopped. Sterling stepped forward until his shadow fell across Andrew's face. The morning sun behind him made him look 10 feet tall. Your presence here is already a stain, boy. Someone like you was never meant to stand on my grass. His voice dropped to almost a whisper, but the garden was so quiet that every person heard it. Your kind doesn't belong at tables like these. You don't belong in gardens like this. The only reason you lasted 3 years is because I pitied you, and that pity just ran out. He pointed at the money on the ground. Now pick it up and get off my property. The garden was silent. A bee buzzed past Andrew's ear. Somewhere a mimosa glass clinked against a tray. Nobody moved. Andrew looked down at the bills scattered across the grass he'd planted, the roses he'd pruned, the stone path he'd laid by hand. 3 years of his life spread out under the morning sun, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles went white, his jaw locked. Something behind his eyes shifted, not anger, something deeper, something quieter. He knelt, picked up every bill, one by one, folded them, put them in his pocket beside the torn drawing. Then he stood, looked Sterling Whitmore in the eye for 2 full seconds, and walked away. He passed the rose beds he'd planted 3 years ago. They were blooming the fullest bloom of the season, the most beautiful things in that entire garden. He didn't look at them. He walked through the iron gate and didn't look back. Behind him, the jazz quartet started playing again. The mimosas resumed. The laughter returned, as if nothing had happened at all. Andrew Jacobs sat on the edge of his bed and counted the money. $8,000. 80 $100 bills. He laid them out on the kitchen table of his 1-bedroom rental, the table with the wobbly leg that he'd fixed with a folded piece of cardboard. The bills were wrinkled. Some had grass stains. One had a smear of champagne across Benjamin Franklin's face. He stared at them for a long time. Then he pulled the 2 halves of his blueprint from his pocket, laid them side by side on the table, edges touching. The design was still there. The Eastern Garden, the curves, the bloom calendar. A perfect plan torn in 2. He didn't tape them together, not yet. He just looked at them. The next morning, Andrew started looking for work. He called every landscaping company within 30 miles. He showed up at garden centers. He walked into nurseries with his notebook under his arm, ready to show anyone what he could do. Nobody called back. By the 2nd week, he figured out why. Word travels fast in the landscaping world, and Sterling Whitmore's world was bigger than most. Andrew didn't know exactly what Sterling had said, but he could guess from the way receptionists suddenly got busy when he walked in, from the way managers glanced at his name on the application and shook their heads, from the way one woman at a nursery in Westfield looked at him with something close to pity and said, "I'm sorry, honey, we just can't." Sterling hadn't just fired him, he'd buried him. The worst part wasn't the rejection, it was the look on people's faces when they heard his name. A mix of pity and caution, like he was radioactive. One nursery owner in Cranford pulled Andrew aside and said quietly, "Look, son, I believe you can do the work, but Whitmore supplies half my clients. If I hire you, I lose them. I can't afford that. I'm sorry." Andrew thanked him, walked to the bus stop, sat on the bench for 40 minutes before realizing he'd missed 3 buses. He wasn't waiting for a bus, he was just sitting. 3 weeks and the money started to disappear. Rent, electricity, rice and canned beans. A bus pass because his truck had died 2 months ago and he couldn't afford to fix it. Every bill he peeled off the stack felt like Sterling winning again. By the 4th week, Andrew had $3,200 left. He sat at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, notebook open, pen in hand, drawing nothing, just staring at the wall. He thought about going home, back to his mother's apartment in Trenton, back to the neighborhood where nobody expected anything from anybody, and that was supposed to be fine. He could get a job bagging groceries. He could mow lawns on weekends. He could live small and quiet and never bother anyone again. That's what Sterling would have wanted. That's what know your place meant. Andrew closed the notebook, stood up, walked to the back window. He'd never really looked at the lot behind his apartment. It was maybe a quarter-acre, mostly weeds, broken glass, and hard-packed dirt. The landlord used it as a dump for old furniture. A rusted washing machine sat in the far corner like a gravestone. But Andrew wasn't looking at the weeds. He was looking at the slope. The way the ground tilted gently toward the south, which meant full sun from morning to late afternoon. He was looking at the old concrete wall along the back edge, ugly, but the right height for a terraced planting bed. He was looking at the drainage pattern in the soil, the way rainwater had carved a natural channel along the eastern side. He was seeing what he always saw, what Sterling Whitmore had never understood. He was seeing a garden. Andrew opened his notebook to a blank page. First blank page in months, he'd filled the rest while working at the estate. He picked up his pen. This time he wasn't designing for Sterling Whitmore. He wasn't designing for a client or a magazine or anyone with money. For the first time in his life, he was designing for himself. He drew until the sun came up. The next day, Andrew took $1,800 to a salvage yard and bought materials. Reclaimed stone, weathered railroad ties, 2 pallets of river rock. He spent another $400 at a wholesale nursery on the other side of town, the one that didn't know Sterling's name. Heirloom seeds, perennial roots, 3 bare-root David Austin roses, the same variety he'd planted at the estate. He kept $1,000 for rent and food. That gave him 2 months. 2 months to build something, or 2 months to fail. He started digging that evening, cleared the weeds by hand, pulled out the broken glass piece by piece, hauled the rusted washing machine to the curb. By midnight, his hands were bleeding, and the lot looked worse than before, just raw, torn-up dirt. But to Andrew, it looked like a beginning. He came back the next day, and the next, and the next. Every morning at 5, he'd leave for whatever day job he could find, washing dishes at a diner, unloading trucks at a warehouse, cleaning offices at night. The kind of work that pays cash and doesn't ask questions. Then he'd come home, eat whatever was cheapest, and walk out to the lot. He worked by flashlight when the sun went down. He worked until his shoulders burned and his knees ached, and the neighbors turned off their lights. Some nights he didn't stop until 2 or 3 in the morning. Mrs. Patterson, the woman in the apartment next door, watched him through her kitchen window one night. She'd lived in that building for 19 years and had never seen anyone set foot in that lot except to dump garbage. Now there was a man out there in the dark, kneeling in the dirt, digging by the light of a hardware store flashlight held between his teeth. She didn't know what he was building, but she could tell he was building something. The first week, Andrew cleared the ground. He pulled weeds until his back seized. He dug out roots as thick as his wrist. He hauled 17 bags of broken glass and debris to the curb. When he was done, all that remained was raw earth, dark, damp, and open. It didn't look like much, but Andrew knew something about dirt that most people never learn. It's not empty. It's waiting. The second week he started shaping. He laid the reclaimed stone in a curving path that followed the natural slope of the lot. Not straight, never straight. Andrew had spent years studying the gardens of Frederick Law Olmsted, the man who designed Central Park. Olmsted understood that the human eye doesn't follow a straight line. It follows a curve. It wants to see what's around the bend. So Andrew built bends. The path curved south, then looped east, then opened into a small clearing where he'd placed 3 flat stones in a triangle, a sitting area. From that spot, you could see 3 different views of the terraced wall. The rose beds he hadn't planted yet, and a gap in the old fence where the afternoon sun poured through like a spotlight. None of this was accidental. Every angle was measured. Every sight line was planned. He'd drawn it all in the notebook months ago. Now he was building it with his hands. By the end of the first month, the bones of the garden were visible. The terraced wall along the back was the first thing that made Mrs. Patterson stop and stare. Andrew had taken the ugly concrete wall and covered it with a stacked stone facade using salvaged material from the railroad ties. Then he built 3 planting shelves into the stone, each at a different height. Low herbs in front, mid-height perennials in the middle, tall ornamental grasses at the top. Layering. The same technique he'd used at Whitmore Estate. But here, without a budget, he had to improvise. He built an irrigation system from cut PVC pipe and recycled water bottles, gravity-fed from a rain barrel he'd assembled from a trash can and a downspout. It cost him $11. It worked perfectly. By month 2, things began to grow. The David Austin roses were the first to show color, pale pink buds that opened into cups the size of a child's fist. The lavender came next, spreading along the stone path in soft purple waves. Then the salvia, the echinacea, the black-eyed Susans. Color crept across the lot like a slow sunrise. Andrew adjusted everything as it grew. He moved a cluster of hostas that was getting too much afternoon sun. He added a layer of mulch around the roses to keep moisture in. He trained a clematis vine up the concrete wall, hiding the last patch of ugly gray behind a curtain of white flowers. The neighbors noticed. First, it was Mrs. Patterson who started bringing Andrew lemonade on Saturday afternoons and standing at the edge of the lot, shaking her head in disbelief. "Baby, where did you learn to do this?" Then it was the couple across the street who walked over one evening with their daughter on his shoulders. They stood at the entrance to the path, the entrance Andrew had framed with 2 wooden posts and a simple arbor, and the man said, "This looks like something out of a magazine." Then it was the teenagers from the next block who came by to take selfies in front of the rose wall. Then it was a young woman named Tessa. Tessa lived 4 buildings down. She worked as a graphic designer and spent most of her free time on Instagram. She walked past the lot one Sunday morning in early July, 3 months after Andrew had started, and stopped dead in her tracks. The garden was in full bloom. Morning light poured through the gap in the fence and lit up the entire space like a cathedral window. The roses glowed. The stone path shimmered with dew. The terraced wall was a cascade of green and purple and white, and in the middle of it all, Andrew was kneeling beside a bed of lavender, adjusting a drip line with a pair of pliers. Tessa took 12 photos. She posted the best one that afternoon with a caption, "There's a secret garden behind the apartments on Miller Street. I have no idea who built it, but it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in this neighborhood. Does anyone know who this man is?" The post got 300 likes in 2 hours. By the next morning it had 12,000. By the end of the week, 50,000. People started showing up. Not just from the neighborhood from across the city. They came to see the garden that a stranger had built on a trash lot. Local blogs picked it up. A landscaping forum wrote a feature. A reporter from the city paper left her card on Andrew's door with a handwritten note. "I'd love to talk to you about what you've built." Andrew didn't call her back. Not yet. He wasn't finished. But the internet doesn't wait for you to be finished. 3 days after Tessa's post crossed 50,000 likes, Andrew found an email in the free inbox he'd set up years ago and never used. The subject line read, "I want to hire you." A woman in Maplewood. She'd seen the photos. She had a backyard that she described as hopeless. A rectangle of dead grass, a broken fence, and a drainage problem that turned it into a swamp every time it rained. "I don't have a huge budget," she wrote, "but I've never seen anyone do what you do. Would you be willing to come look at it?" Andrew read the email 3 times. He looked at the garden outside his window, the garden he'd built with $1,800 in salvaged materials and $400 in seeds. The garden that had started with nothing but dirt and broken glass. Then he picked up his pen and opened his notebook to a fresh page. He wrote back, "I'd be happy to. When works for you?" The Maplewood job took Andrew 3 weeks. The woman's name was Linda Greer, single mother of 2. She'd bought the house because it was cheap, and the backyard was the reason it was cheap. A soggy rectangle of dead grass with a fence that leaned so far it looked like it was trying to escape. Andrew walked the yard on a Tuesday afternoon. He didn't say much. He crouched, pressed his hand into the soil, felt the clay layer underneath. He studied the drainage pattern, the angle of the afternoon light, the shadow the neighbor's maple cast after 3 o'clock. He made notes in his notebook. 3 days later, he came back with a plan. He solved the drainage first, a simple French drain made from gravel and perforated pipe, angled toward the street. Then he built a raised stone patio where the soggiest patch used to be. Around it, he planted a border of native perennials, things that would come back every year without fuss. He built a small arbor at the entrance to the yard and ran a climbing hydrangea up both sides. Total cost of materials, $1,400. Linda's entire budget. When Linda walked into her backyard on the last day, she covered her mouth with both hands. Then she started crying. "It doesn't even look like the same place," she said. It wasn't. Linda told her neighbor. Her neighbor told the woman from her book club. The book club woman told her sister-in-law, who happened to be renovating a house on the other side of town. By the end of the month, Andrew had 3 projects. By the end of the second month, he had 7. Every job was different. A retired couple who wanted a meditation garden. A restaurant owner who needed a courtyard that felt like Tuscany. A young family who just wanted their kids to have somewhere beautiful to play. Andrew designed each one from scratch by hand in his notebook. No 2 gardens were alike. Each one was a response to the land, the light, and the people who lived there. He charged what he could, sometimes barely enough to cover materials. But every finished garden became a calling card. People would drive by a house, see the yard, stop the car, and knock on the door. "Who did your landscaping?" The answer was always the same. A guy named Andrew. 5 months after the garden party at Whitmore Estate, Andrew filed the paperwork for a small business. He sat at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd counted $8,000 in grass-stained bills, and wrote the company name on the form, Jacobs Landscape Design. He stared at it for a long time. Then he signed. The call from Architectural Digest came 2 weeks later. A features editor named Rachel Dunn. She'd seen Tessa's Instagram post, tracked down 3 of Andrew's completed projects, and driven out to see them herself. She called Andrew from the parking lot of the Maplewood house. "Mr. Jacobs, I'm going to be direct. I've covered landscape architecture for 9 years. What you're doing is some of the most original residential work I've seen in this region. I'd like to do a feature." Andrew was quiet for a moment. "I'm not sure I'm the right fit for your magazine." "Why not?" "I don't have a degree. I don't have certifications. 6 months ago, I was pulling weeds for a man who paid me $12 an hour." "That," Rachel said, "is exactly why you're the right fit." The interview took 4 hours. Rachel asked about everything, his techniques, his influences, his philosophy. Andrew talked about Olmsted, about the Japanese concept of borrowed scenery, about how a garden should feel like it grew there on its own, even if every stone was placed with intention. Then she asked about Sterling Whitmore. Andrew was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was level. No anger, no bitterness, just facts. "He gave me $8,000 and told me to get off his property. I used the money to buy seeds. Rachel wrote that down word for word. The article ran the following month with a full-page photo, Andrew standing in the Miller Street garden, morning light behind him, dirt on his hands. On the wall of his small office behind him, visible just over his left shoulder, was the torn blueprint. Both halves, taped together and mounted in a simple black frame. The headline read, "The $8,000 Garden, How a Fired Gardener is Rewriting the Rules of Landscape Design." The article changed everything. Within a week, Andrew's email had 200 inquiries. Within 2 weeks, he'd hired his first employee, a young landscaper named Tony Bowles, who'd been laid off from a commercial mowing crew. Within a month, he had a small office, a used truck, and more work than he could handle. That's when Harrington Resorts entered the picture. Harrington was building a luxury coastal resort, a 200-room property on 40 acres of oceanfront land. The landscape design contract was worth $3 million. Every major firm in the state had submitted a bid. So had Sterling Whitmore, who had personally lobbied the Harrington family at a charity gala. Andrew submitted his proposal on the last day of the deadline. Handwritten cover letter, digital portfolio of 12 completed projects, a preliminary design concept that he'd stayed up 3 nights sketching. He didn't expect to win. He just wanted them to see his work. 2 weeks later, his phone rang. It was the Vice President of Development at Harrington Resorts. "Mr. Jacobs, we've reviewed all 23 proposals. The committee's decision was unanimous." Andrew was kneeling in a client's garden when he took the call. His hands were covered in soil. His knees were caked in mud. He pressed the phone to his ear with his shoulder. "We'd like to offer you the contract." Andrew didn't answer right away. He looked at his hands, dirt under every nail, calluses on every finger. The same hands Sterling Whitmore had pointed at and said were built for shovels. "Mr. Jacobs, are you still there?" "Yes," Andrew said. "I'm here. I'll take it." Sterling Whitmore found out on a Thursday. He was sitting in his home office, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the garden Andrew had built. He was reading an email from the Harrington Group's development team. Short, polite, final. "Thank you for your interest, Mr. Whitmore. After careful review, we've selected another firm for the landscape design contract. We appreciate your time and wish you the best." Sterling read it twice. Then he picked up the phone and called his assistant. "Who did they pick?" "A company called Jacobs Landscape Design, sir." Silence. "Jacobs?" "Yes, sir. Based locally, relatively new. The founder's name is Andrew Jacobs." Sterling didn't move. He stared at the garden through the window, the boxwood hedges, the stone path, the David Austin roses. And for the first time, something cold moved through his chest. "Send me everything you can find on them." 20 minutes later, his assistant walked in with a printout, the Architectural Digest article, full page. Sterling looked at the photo first, a man standing in a garden, morning light, dirt on his hands. He recognized the hands before he recognized the face. The article was titled, "The $8,000 Garden." Sterling read the whole thing, every word. He read about the trash lot, about the $11 irrigation system, about the Instagram post that went viral, about the clients who cried when they saw their finished gardens. Then he got to the quote. "He gave me $8,000 and told me to get off his property. I used the money to buy seeds." Sterling set the paper down. His hand was trembling just slightly, but enough that he noticed. He looked out the window at the garden again. The garden, he'd told Eleanor Caldwell, was designed by a top firm from the city. The garden that Andrew Jacobs had built with his bare hands, one stone at a time, one rose at a time, for 3 years. He didn't pick the paper up again for a long time. His assistant appeared in the doorway again. "Sir, there's something else. Harrington is requesting that you collaborate with the landscape firm on the resort's infrastructure grading drainage site access. They want both parties at the table. They want me to work with him. Yes, sir. Sterling looked at the garden outside his window one more time. Then he stood up. Set a meeting. Andrew's office was on the second floor of a converted warehouse on the east side of town. Small, clean. The walls were white, and every surface had a plant on it. Pothos trailing from shelves, a fiddle-leaf fig in the corner. Succulents lined up along the windowsill like little soldiers. Sterling Whitmore had never been to this part of town. He sat in his car for 3 minutes before going in. His driver asked if everything was all right. Sterling didn't answer. He walked up the stairs. The door was open. Andrew was standing at a drafting table, pencil in hand, working on a drawing. He looked up when Sterling appeared in the doorway. Neither man spoke for a full 5 seconds. Mr. Whitmore. Andrew's voice was steady. No warmth, no hostility, just level. Come in. Sterling stepped inside. His eyes moved around the room, the plants, the sketches pinned to the walls, the small bookshelf filled with volumes on landscape architecture, botany, soil science. And then his eyes found it. On the wall behind Andrew's desk, a simple black frame. Inside the frame, 2 halves of a hand-drawn blueprint taped together down the middle, the edges still ragged where they'd been torn. Sterling stopped breathing. He recognized it instantly. The Eastern Garden redesign, the one he'd ripped out of Andrew's notebook and torn in half in front of 50 guests on a bright Saturday morning while the jazz played and the mimosas flowed and everyone laughed. It was hanging on the wall like a diploma. Sterling's mouth opened, then closed. He took a step toward the frame, as if he needed to see it closer to believe it was real. The tape down the middle was visible, a thin line of clear adhesive, holding together what he had torn apart with 2 hands and zero thought on a Saturday morning 1 year ago. He remembered the sound it made. He remembered the way the 2 halves floated to the grass. He remembered the look on Andrew's face, still steady, unbroken. And now that same drawing hung on a wall in an office that Sterling Whitmore had to drive to. Andrew followed his gaze. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Please, sit down. Andrew gestured to the chair across from his drafting table. Can I get you water? Coffee? No, I'm fine. Sterling sat. He didn't look comfortable. The chair was simple wood and canvas, the kind of chair a man uses because it works, not because it impresses. Andrew pulled a large roll of paper from a shelf and spread it across the table. The resort design. 40 acres of coastal landscape, walking paths, native plantings, a series of garden rooms that transition from formal, near the buildings, to wild meadow at the oceanfront. Water features, a rooftop garden on the main hotel, a boardwalk lined with seagrasses. It was extraordinary. Sterling studied the plans in silence. He traced the pathways with his finger. He looked at the planting schedules, the grading diagrams, the irrigation maps. His jaw tightened, then loosened, then tightened again. He knew what he was looking at. He'd worked with landscape architects before, expensive ones, famous ones. None of them had produced anything like this. The precision was clinical. The vision was artistic. The combination was something he'd never seen on paper before. And it had come from the man he'd called the yard boy. This is, Sterling started, then stopped. He ran his hand over his mouth. This is remarkable work. Thank you, Andrew said. Nothing more. Silence filled the room. Sterling looked at Andrew's hands resting on the edge of the drafting table. They were the same hands, calloused, scarred, dirt visible under 3 of the fingernails even now, even in a meeting. But those hands had just drawn something that would transform 40 acres of coastline. Andrew, Sterling paused again. He looked at the framed blueprint on the wall, then back at Andrew. I need to say something. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. Another pause, the longest one yet. What I did that day was wrong. Sterling's voice was barely above a whisper. I knew it was wrong when I did it, and I did it anyway. Andrew said nothing. He let the silence hold. I've thought about it, Sterling continued, more than I expected to. Andrew nodded slowly. Then he reached across the table and turned the resort plans to face Sterling fully. $8,000, Andrew said. That was the price of the best opportunity of my life. He pulled a contract from the drawer and placed it beside the plans. Harrington wants both of us at the table. I'm leading the design. You're handling infrastructure. If you're comfortable with that, we can start next month. Sterling looked at the contract. He looked at Andrew. He looked at the torn blueprint on the wall one last time. Then he picked up the pen and signed. Andrew Jacobs was the lead. Sterling Whitmore was the support. The garden party had lasted one morning. This would last much longer. The Harrington Coastal Resort opened on a Saturday morning in September. 200 rooms, 40 acres, and a landscape that took people's breath away the moment they stepped out of their cars. The walking paths wound through native seagrasses and coastal wildflowers. The garden rooms transitioned from clipped hedges and stone fountains near the lobby to untamed meadows at the oceanfront. A rooftop garden on the main building offered views of the entire property, and every angle, every sightline, every patch of light had been planned by the same man who once dug in a trash lot by flashlight. Architectural Digest covered the opening. So did the New York Times. The American Society of Landscape Architects awarded the project their highest honor, the National Design Award. Andrew Jacobs stood at the podium in a navy suit with dirt still faintly visible under his nails. He kept his speech short. Everything I know I learned from the ground up, literally. The audience laughed. Then they gave him a standing ovation. 6 months after the resort opened, Andrew did something that nobody expected. He took a portion of his earnings from the Harrington contract and created a program. He called it Ground Up, a scholarship and mentorship initiative for young people from low-income neighborhoods who wanted to learn landscape design. No tuition, no prerequisites, just a willingness to show up, get dirty, and learn. The first class had 9 students. 3 of them had never held a shovel before. 2 had dropped out of high school. 1 had spent 6 months in juvenile detention. 1 was a single mother who brought her toddler to class in a stroller. 1 was a retired veteran who said he hadn't built anything since he came home. Andrew didn't ask about their pasts. He didn't care where they came from or what people had told them they were. He'd heard all those words himself: yard boy, cheap labor, the help. He knew what it felt like to have someone look at your hands and decide your future for you. So he asked them to look at a patch of dirt and tell him what they saw. Most of them saw nothing. Andrew smiled. Good. That's where I started too. He taught them the way he'd taught himself, by doing. They learned soil composition by running it through their fingers. They learned drainage by watching where puddles formed after rain. They learned design by building gardens for families who couldn't afford landscapers. Every garden they built was free. Every garden was different. And every garden was beautiful. On a warm afternoon in late October, Andrew was kneeling in a community garden in Trenton, the neighborhood where he'd grown up. Beside him was a 17-year-old girl named Maya, who was learning how to graft a rose cutting onto rootstock. Her hands were shaking. "Steady," Andrew said. He placed his hand over hers, his calloused, scarred hand, guiding her smooth one. You don't force it. You let the plant tell you where it wants to join. Maya made the cut. It was clean. Perfect, Andrew said. He looked across the garden, the beds these kids had built, the paths they'd laid, the colors they'd chosen. Then he looked down at his own hands, still rough, still marked by soil, The same hands that had picked up $8,000 off a billionaire's lawn. The same hands that had turned it into this. If this story moved you, drop a comment. What would you have done if someone threw money at your feet and told you that you'd never be anything? Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because stories like Andrew's, they deserve to be told.
$8,000 thrown on the launch like trash. 1 year later, the same billionaire sat across from Andrew Jacobs, not as his boss, at his support, when Sterling tore that blueprint in half in front of 50 people who said nothing. Andrew didn't fight back. He picked up both pieces, folded them, and later he tapped them together and hung them on his wall like a diploma. That's a man who knew his own worth before anyone else did. And that's the real lesson here. Your worth was never in someone else's hands. Andrew didn't need permission to be great. He needed $1,800 in salvaged stone, 400 in seeds, and the same two hands a billionaire said were only built for shovels. Those hands designed a 40-acre coastal resort. Same dirt under the nails. The only thing that changed was who was paying attention. So let me ask you this. If the people around you could only see what you are today, never what you're becoming, would you still keep building? And the person who said you would never be enough, do they even cross your mind anymore? Drop your answer in the comments. If this story hit home, share it with someone still building in silence. Hit subscribe. Stories like Andrew's deserve to be remembered.